today, March 13th, we recognize that date in our history. And it is very significant, I should say, that our guest today was a youth revolutionary, Dr. Stephen Fletcher. Dr. Stephen Fletcher, good afternoon and welcome to GEM FM once again and to the comfort zone. Oh boy, watch a shot. Where John, you see shot, boy? Hey, the shot even changed the complexion too, you know? Hey, you telling me, boy? And first, I want to apologize, Brother John. You know, all the time I don't send the man the link, boy.
Really?
Yes, all the time. I'm telling you. That man should have get that link since when? Because I had Steve Maxime on last night and he had the link since the day before. Wow. And I wonder, and I ain't seen the man, you know. Anyway, my apologies.
No problem. You're welcome. You're welcome, Pablo. And thanks for having me. And revolutionary greetings to all of your viewers, listeners, your fan base. Today is, of course, a very significant day. It ought to be a very significant day for Grenada, the Caribbean, the developing world, and for people all around the world who have been, in one way or the other, struggling and in the fight for freedom, economic and social justice, political equity, and all the positives that we wish for in life. So today, in fact, for me, is a very important and very solemn day.
Yes, with that being said, you were a youth involved with the revolution during that period. And while our conversation this afternoon is not necessarily about the revolution, we can't be dismissive of it, and we need to say something about it. What can you tell us about being a youth in the revolution and the focus of the revolution on youth development during that period?
Well, you know, let me say that you must be, yourself and the GEM family, must be congratulated for speaking about the revolution. I think one of the difficulties we have had over the years, one of the downsides of the Grenadian history and the Grenada development paradigm is that since 1983, we tend to forget that there was a revolution on March 13th. And that revolution was indeed impactful. We almost became silent on this issue. I myself have been involved over the years in going to schools and so, and discussing with young people generally about the revolution, its causes, consequences, the downsides, and so on. So you must be applauded for, no matter what you want to discuss today, for inserting into that discussion elements of the revolution, and indeed my own involvement as a young person in that process. So before I answer your substantial question, Pedro, Pablo, I hope you wouldn't mind if I just mention how I got to that space, that revolutionary space at a very young age.
No problem.
At a very young age, I was in fact in secondary school in 1979 when the revolution took place. And I was not in Form 5, nor Form 4. So it's an indication of how youthful I was at the time. But Pablo, at a very, very early age, in fact, I can safely say probably at the age of about 12 or 13, I was fully aware of the political dynamics playing out in Grenada and certainly in the community that I came from, which is Concord in St. John. The era or the theater for persons like Kakadimokran, but also Fedon and the Great Fedon Rebellion and all the other things that string from that. So I was quite aware of the politics and the development of Grenada at the time. I was very much aware of the existing political system, and in fact, I was drawn to it in a very serious way at that age, thinking about development, thinking about health, and so on. In fact, by 1976, 77, and so on, with the involvement of people in the community like this is George Luzon and persons like Einstein Luzon and so on, I started to really become aware of things from a political point of view, but also from a developmental point of view. So during that period, I got involved in the community group in Concord. There was a group called PSYCO, Concord Youth and Cultural Organization. And I was involved in that, and that's where I learned a whole lot of organizational skills. Later on, I think by 1978, I was involved in the NYO. I was probably the youngest chappie that used to be following persons like Disease Against Chester Luzon and others to go out, having meetings and so on. And then I got automatically propelled into beginning to organize student councils and youth groups throughout the country. That's how I got to know people in St. Rose and McDonald College and SAS and so forth. Because at that initial period, I was at the St. John's Christian Secondary School, Shaper. But through the organization I was involved in, I was all over the country helping develop student councils, which was a critical part of the organizing process at the time. And therefore, that involvement led me to be engaged until the revolution collapsed in 1983. But at that period, there were some fundamental changes that were taking place globally and locally that served as the propellant for persons like myself engaging. We had the Black Power movement in the United States, and that began to have its effect throughout. We had the Blazer strike at the Grenada Boys Secondary School, which was a throwback against the period of time, which was a sort of colonial era, remnants of that, which continued, in which the boys were meant to be wearing blazers to go to school in this very tropical climate and so forth. And there was reaction to that. And I was very aware of those things and got engaged in the process leading up to March 1379. As you know, there were quite a lot of discussions about revolution taking place. We were also faced with the gauntlet of Geary himself and the deprivations that we felt during that period. The fact that you couldn't gather, you had the Mongoose gang enraged and persons who had been beaten up. You couldn't publish papers. In fact, leading up to that, I was one of those persons who was involved in
selling
selling
the paper underground.
Exactly. The jewel was a critical part of that process. So we were really engaged as young people at the time and in contributing towards the revolution. As you may recall very well, the revolution was fundamentally a youth-led revolution, youth and students, because at that time...
If I may add to, not wanting to cut you, but if I may add two other elements that would have been an additional factor in the mindset and the politics that existed during that period. The Black Power movement was coming on the heels of the civil rights movement in the US, which with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and so, which had its own impact. And then we were in that era where you had all of the anti-colonial struggles and the level of solidarity that was taking place between Africa, the Central America, and the Caribbean during that period. It was the era of the progressives.
Absolutely. One cannot negate that global dimension that you have brought in, and some very important things. And young people today, we need to interact more with them. We need to pass on the information and so on. So you're absolutely right. The global climate, you may recall, was one in which countries in Africa and so on was emerging from colonialism. From in the Caribbean, similar movements were taking place. So we had this influence of the rise of leadership in Ghana, in various countries and so on that was happening. But we also had some very important thing that was happening that was helping to reshape the philosophical dimension of the world. There began to be rise of counter powers around the world. So you had the rise, for example, in this of the socialist states out of Europe. We had socialism, which basically was saying, look, there is an alternative path to development. There is an alternative path to what you have been going through so far, a path that was embedded in capitalism, where you had a few that was exploiting the rest of the population, that the producers of the wealth were not really the beneficiaries of the wealth. So there was issues of the redistribution of income and the redistribution of wealth taking place. And that played an important part in shaping the New Jewel movement and how it developed. In fact, the slogan of the New Jewel movement at the time, which was "Let those who labor hold the reins," was a direct result of a recognition of that exploitative nature that existed between the worker and those who own capital and so on, and the need to readjust that. So there were these elements that were in fact taking place. There was also the feeling of, in the Grenadian context, that we were not part of that development paradigm, that we were left out, that Grenada started going down a path in which Grenadians were not beneficiaries of that development. We were not beneficiaries of the very things Grenadian. And we were, in fact, excluded from that process. And Grenadians object to that kind of system. Anytime we think that our labor, our sacrifices, our resources are in fact benefiting those who really was not part of the creation of it. And therefore the Jewel movement, the New Jewel movement at the time, I think were able to message on those issues very effectively to the young people and to the nation at large, not just young people, but to the nation at large. And therefore that became a rally in cry at that time. But it gave rise to a number of things that, as I indicated before, that people had a sense of injustice. And people wanted to reverse that trend. And the New Jewel movement provided a path, right, to whereby people can in fact do that. So that on the morning of March 13th, 1979, it really was a new dawn for many persons. People felt relief coming out of the backdrop of some of the ills that existed in the society up to that point in time. And therefore, my engagement was out of a deep feeling at that time of a sense of injustice in the society. But more importantly, Pablo, it was about the future. It was about, for many of us as young persons at the time, the hope for a better future, the hope for a better quality of life, the hope for our ability to access education and to become what we want to become, the hope that our country will be our own and that we'll be part of it, we'll be part of that development paradigm going forward, and that the future will be bright for us. And our involvement was mainly triggered by that. It was not one of personal desires and personal hopes. I mean, you might have heard me say this a million times, that my engagement, my career choice, for example, was never dictated by what I, Stephen Fletcher, wanted to have for myself. It was dictated along my life path by what can I do to develop this country? How can I contribute towards the development of this country? In fact, interestingly, this morning I was going through some documents, redoing my library and so on, and I ran into something that was done when I was in cable and wireless at the time. It was in the 1990s, 1990s. And remember the time I was working with a private international company where profit maximization was an important goal for them, but also we had other goals, social developmental goals. And in my career development plan was documented that I want to be in a position where I can contribute to the development of my country and people. Yeah. And that to me was, it kind of hit me on March 13th of my journey thus far in making myself and my skill sets available to this country that we love so much, a country that we hope to see rise, everyone rising as the water rises, that we too rise with it. And that's where I come into this and remain committed to a process that can lead to the development of all of our people, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomic backgrounds and positions, you know. So March 13 for me and for the persons like, many guys like, for example, Delbert Battis, or even Brother John Callis himself, right? I think we came out of that. It was not of personal desire. It was about a commitment to see the country rise.
Now, we see that the vast majority of people who held leadership positions, and we're talking about senior leadership positions in that development thrust within the revolutionary framework, were people under 30 years of age. Some barely past 20 if they were. And we had a situation where the entity that emerged and which eventually planned and implemented the revolution were basically young people of that age group. And when these young people merged, the entity, I should say, was the merger of different anti-Gary entities. And the young people among those elders, they emerged as the leaders among the elders. Today, we have a situation where we have similar circumstances to the pre-revolutionary period. But our young people do not seem to have the same acumen in terms of getting to that place of organization and structure in order to challenge what exists. And we see questions being asked. Like there was a banner post from one of the youth leaders recently on social media. What will it take for the young people of Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique to take charge of our future? What advice would you give to these young people who are struggling with that situation?
You know, this is one of the most critical questions that confronts us today as a country. And it's a good question really for the sociologists and so to begin to really delve into. Because it's a really clear indicator of that paradigm shift that is needed to move the country in a lot of sense. I think there are many things. The situation can be quite complex. I think it is complex. It is not as straightforward as some people will like us to believe.
No, it's not straightforward.
Right? It's a very complex issue.
Nothing ever really is straightforward.
It's a complex issue. But I think, firstly, to say to young people is that, you know, there's a backdrop to this. Mm-hmm. And part of that backdrop, I think, is the fact that following the collapse of the revolution in 1983, that there was a generation or two that really went underground. Meaning that we did not discuss politics. We did not discuss the challenges of growing up and the challenges of where we are today. So for myself, for example, when I speak to young people, when I go to the schools and so on, they're literally in awe because they're so, where's the history? Nobody told us those things. Nobody told us that young persons at the age of 16 and 17 and 18 were so engaged in this revolutionary process. That yourself as a student at the time would have been involved as president of the National Students Council and interacting with principals and ministries, ministry officials and so on in making changes. So there was that gap that exists in terms of the transforming of information, the transferring rather of information to the younger generation. Secondly, I also believe there is a question of need. So many a times, especially in our context, that we have been moved to action because there were pressing deprivations and so on in the society, and there was a need for a collective effort to change it. That, I think, has been shifted a little bit. Most young people now living in socioeconomic conditions that marked an improvement over our conditions, and therefore there was not a felt need to make that fundamental change. Thirdly, and I think very importantly, is the absence of organization and leadership. Despite the objective conditions that we are seeing here in Grenada today, I refer to things like unemployment levels, for example, the challenges of furthering one's education and career and so on, issues of economic realities of this life, issues regarding the ownership of our land and the resources and the direction that is going. We do not have an organization and a leadership that is able to weave a narrative to get young people to understand the challenges that will confront them in the future. And therefore, the motivation that is required to galvanize young people into a structure that will allow them to be expressing of their needs and their desires, and to achieve their goals and to remove some of the obstacles that they face today, that is not there. So the organization and the leadership, I think, is one of the fundamental deficits that we have in our society, that is not causing people to really, young people in particular, to get organized and to get focused. I think that is one of the main things that is really missing, and that needs to come into play so that young people, students, the unemployed youth, the employed youth, can be galvanized really into taking action so that their future needs and wants can be satisfied.
Finally, on that issue, now, given the fact that you say leadership is lacking in terms of getting the youths to move in that direction, and considering the fact that we see there's quite a few of them, they're regular on social media, speaking about development issues, taking the authorities to task on various issues and so on. Don't you think it is possible for them among themselves to be able to develop a construct to serve their own interest?
You're absolutely correct. And that this thing takes time, but it is evolving. Now, let me hasten to make this point, that the way we organized 20 years ago, 15 years ago, is not the same way young people organize today. The need for, and that was, the situation has been worsened because of COVID. So the need for people to come together, meeting in community centers, in face-to-face meetings and so on, as we did in the past, that no longer exists. Young people are organized through social media, and we have seen it throughout the entire globe, all right? Social media is the driving force, to a large extent, to youth action or to people's action. So I am quite confident that with the current construct that we have of the use of social media and young people engagement, leadership will emerge. And leadership will emerge in two ways, in my view. One, through ideas. Ideas are going to be thrown out there, and persons are going to follow the idea, whatever that idea turns out to be. People are going to follow that idea. It will not be an issue of who as a person that we are following, as much as we are following a concept. We are following an ideal, as we did during the revolution. During the pre-revolution and revolutionary period, what we follow were dreams or ideals of what this society, what kind of society we want. In a similar way, using social media, I see that emerging. With regards to, and it always comes down to, well, who would be the leaders? That leadership could very well emerge from the social media interactions that are taking place. Many a times, I have to kind of take a deep breath when I meet young persons in groupings and recognize that some of them are meeting for the very first time in person, but they have been in contact on social media, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, for probably a year, 2 years. They have been chatting with each other, they have been exchanging ideas, they have been seeing each other via the means that we are using now, but in person they have never. But these persons have been able to will themselves in groups, in organizations, using that method. So we are in a new era. This new era requires some fundamental adaptations, right? As you call it, a new paradigm, a new construct for organization and mobilization of young people. There is a fair amount of that taking place now in different fields, in different arenas, all right? What we are yet to see is that force coming together for fundamental national changes, whether it's in the economic sphere, whether it's in sphere of our patriotism and our ownership of our land and our resources, whether it's in the sphere of politics, all right? Because at the end of the day, everything is going to come down to politics and political leadership. Who run things?
Okay. Now, you referenced COVID-19 a while ago. How significant do you think this COVID development is to what's happening now? And what are some of the prevailing current affairs that you think COVID-19 is impacting on? And what are some of the positives and what are some of the negatives?
Let me say this first, that COVID-19, this pandemic that has really ravaged the world and has brought serious human suffering to this world and human anxiety and uncertainties, has been one of the worst things that ever happened to us in this century and so forth. It's been a terrible, terrible thing. So far, God bless, knock wood for this beautiful island of ours. We have not experienced, and I hope that we'll not experience any major human sufferings.
No,
all right?
that'll happen.
In terms of death and so on, yeah?
That'll
So I
happen,
really,
yeah.
all right, good. I like that confidence. Virtually, we don't want to let it stay away, right?
That'll happen, yeah.
So great. But what it has done fundamentally is to really expose some of the structural problems that countries like ours and the Caribbean and so on, and certainly even in the developed world have been having. It really tear back. It's like an onion, peels back and expose some of those difficulties and challenges we had. So, as you know, I've written on this issue of the impact of COVID in the workplace and organizations and so on, and certainly within the economic frame as well. For us in Grenada and the region, the fundamental challenge we have had started with the economics. From the point of view that we have so tweaked this economy of ours to be totally reliant on tourism, that COVID and the inability of persons to travel, the shutdown of the global tourism industry has wreaked havoc on this country. The national income has declined significantly by probably over I think 60% or more. We continue to see businesses that are in a mixed mode of operations. Some of these businesses are only opening 3 and 4 days per week, and so on. We have seen increasing unemployment in a significant way. In fact, the last budget presentation by the Minister of Finance have really opened bare the challenges that the country is facing. So we have the economic issues because we have tweaked the country on a significant reliance on tourism. It is interesting to know that during this period, one of the positive consequences we have seen is an increase in the export of agricultural products. I am told that some of the flights that are coming in, the revenue arm is really from the export of agricultural products, because they are coming in very light with with people from the US and so on, but our exports of things like salsa, right, and other products have been has increased significantly. So we are experiencing a phenomenon which tells us that a diversification in our economy could be good for us in the future. That is over-reliance on tourism and therefore tourism-related services, we can tweak that. So that's been one of the major consequences of the economy. Now, that has trickle-down effects in terms of our social life, the non-interaction of persons and so on, mean that we no longer, when we meet each other, hug and embrace each other and so forth, which we know as human beings is, really significant for us. But one of the things I want to pivot to quickly, which dawned on me in the last couple of months and in the last weeks in particular, is the impact on the education of our young people, our children in particular, and the impact on the parents, and what are the likely consequences of those. So let me drill into this a little bit. So many of these children, especially those in primary school, have been unable to attend school. The school system provides for our young people, it serves three fundamental roles. One is a basic one of providing education for young people. Second role, it performs a social function of interaction with others and the teachers. The teachers provide them with guidance and so on. And three, it is a protective shield. It is a protective shield for young people. During this period, this has been pulled back from them. So as schools move on to using Zoom and other social media tools for education, a significant percent of our course of young people have been eliminated from this. They don't have the tools, they don't have the resources to do it. This is further compounded by the issue of the leadership of the homes, right? As we know in Grenada, many of these homes are led by single mothers. Single mothers. Some of these parents are not equipped to take over the teaching responsibilities of the children at home, because COVID has literally tweaked this thing where teaching now becomes the responsibility of the home. Teaching becomes the responsibility of the family. So here we are, the parents are unable to provide their children with the education, the instructions and so that are needed. But also, some of these parents are either unemployed, are forced to find some variation in their work schedule to be able to be at home to look after their children. That is going to have serious consequences on our future generations who are suffering, right, as a result of COVID and the inability, the fact that nobody was prepared for it, the country was not prepared for it, and we can say that, but certainly we have generations of parents in this country that do not have the basic skills to help teach their children. It was brought home to me forcefully last week when I met a young man who had his 2 children with him. And I asked him, well, what's happening? There's no school for them today? And he says, no, they basically go to school, I think, 3 or so days per week. And that particular day, they were not due to be in school. But he's at work. I know these are children that are in primary school, under the age of 10, I think, but he had to have them with him wherever he's going. And he expressed to me the frustration that he's experiencing, having to do that, because one, he's a single parent, but also, I guess what he didn't say, he doesn't have the skills that are required to teach his children at home. And therefore, that impact is one that we have to be very, very mindful of going forward. That deficit, that deficiency that we have in our overall system. But you know, the sad part about it, I have not seen an urgency in saying, let us address this problem. Let us begin to reconstruct our society going forward, because this epidemic is going to be with us for a while, and we must prepare for others to come. So that, in terms of the impact and the consequence for me, is one that we have to prepare for. The economic issues, we are going to overcome some of it. We'll have vaccines and people will start traveling again to some degree. But you know what? Unless we diversify this economy and we reconstruct our nation, we'll continue to suffer. We'll continue to be at the hem of the outside world, dependent in all forms and fashion, whereas we can reduce that dependency if we were to look internally some more, and if we had to devise policies and programs and so on that our people can contribute to and be beneficiaries of. So we have to look at COVID and ask ourselves, how can we reconstruct our society based on this experience that we are having?
Now, you mentioned the issue of agriculture and the fact that we are exporting more agricultural products. Yesterday evening on the Talking Point program, we had Mr. Steve Maxime, and he is an agricultural specialist. In fact, he has been sharing on this issue of the smart agriculture concept, and he's also an environmentalist and that kind of thing. How critical do you think it is for us, for our agricultural producers, to be able to make that kind of adjustment to what quote unquote qualifies as smart agriculture in order to be able to increase our productivity? And what are some of the measures you think that needs to be taken to get our young people much more involved in that aspect or in that element of our agricultural production, given the fact that it is more or less more scientific than the traditional form of agricultural production?
Okay. So let me say this. To me, the smart agricultural program, the current smart agricultural program, my interpretation is that there are two elements to it. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
There is the technological aspect, the application of technology in agriculture, and the cultural practices side. These two combined. And as we know, the smart agriculture concept has become vogue because of climate change and the impact on agriculture, the impact on our ability to look after ourselves, which is linked also to the COVID matter, how COVID is going to affect food production going forward, because we already see it happening. On the cultural side, I will hasten to say this. Some of the smart agricultural practices that have been advised today were practices that our foreparents and our grandparents and our father used in the past, but which we were encouraged to move away from for one reason or the other. So issues regarding irrigation methods and methodologies was something that we practiced, that we used. We not just getting water from a river and using a pump, but every piece of land, or most pieces of land at the time that I know growing up, you had something called a jupa on that land, a little house made out of whether it's bamboo or whatever. But there was areas for water catchment. You catch water, and when the farmer gets to the land, that water is used for either irrigation purposes or for cooking, because they also cook on the land and so on. So we also had strong agricultural practices in terms of follow-on of the land, how we use the land. This portion is used for this crop, this season, then it is laid to rest, and then we use other things, right? But the inclusion of things like chemical fertilizer and moving away from the manure, the pen manure and so on, has impacted on this. And now we are told, well, in essence, when you dig into what the smart agriculture is all about, is to really revert to some of these cultural practices that we have moved away from. And that is good, that is useful. On the application of the technology and the new technologies and the use of things is useful, very, very useful indeed. But we got to ask ourselves, how can we use the technology, or how can we develop technologies that are appropriate to our environment? For example, working on developing plows to plow the sloping lands that we have. Can we do that? Now, we have, in this day and age, it is not far-fetched that we can have this technology, but I want to see our young people being spurred to think about it and develop it. We have, for example, robotics sweepers that will go and clean your house. You don't have to vacuum manually anymore. That's been done, and they're actually climbing steps and finding corners and so on. Can we do that for our land space as well? Can we develop it for land space? Can we also find ourselves, and again, it's something that I discussed with colleagues at the height of in the early days of the COVID period. Can we embark on a program here where we start to save our indigenous seeds and plants from our indigenous products? Because one of the fundamental challenges we face is the importation of, genetically modified
patented seeds
and what's the impact of that on our ability to produce. When you look at some plants today, mangoes, for example, there are things that are happening with some of these fruits and vegetables, and you ask, well, I never knew that growing up. When you see a nice mango and you pick it, you know it's a nice mango. You can close your eyes and suck down to the seeds. Today, you have to be careful. You got to open it and look at it well because of difficulties, or coconuts and so on. So these are the issues we have today. I say to people, when we speak of these smart issues, let's contextualize it and let us challenge our people, our young people and so on, and our people in general, our adults as well. We must not forget our adults has a great contribution to make in those areas, to think within context, but to develop technologies that can work in our environment, but can also be exported into other countries and generate income. Now, in terms of our young people's participation in agriculture, let's be mindful that a number of things that we have to get right to make this work. Some people sometimes say, well, technology is not going to be a panacea for solving the fundamental problems in agriculture of attracting young people. So firstly, we have a labor issue in agriculture. Yes, that is the case. But we must find out why. Why is it the labor market for agriculture is as such, but the labor market for other aspects of labor, the use of manual labor, is quite different. So why is it easy to attract persons to get involved in a program of debushing and being environmental, whatever, and so on, but we cannot attract the same person to get into productive, production of agricultural products? We have to discuss it as a society, and we have to get a handle on it, right? So we can move it. So we have this labor issue that is very concerning, and so we have the second issue, and they're all linked. Is the issue of compensation, right? Agricultural produce suffer from booms and busts. Today, the price is very high, especially the traditionals like cocoa and nutmegs and so forth. And tomorrow, it goes down very, very low. Therefore, the ability of the landowner and the farmer to pay a steady high price is compromised by this boom and bust, right? So we have to find a way to compensate labor in a way that makes it attractive to be on the land. But there's the other aspect of encouraging young people to be owners of land. Well, there's the issue of land tenureship. Who owns the land? And how can young people access those lands on clear, legit terms that would allow them to then use the land to mobilize the financial and other technical resources they need to work that land. Fourth is an issue of national policies. We'll tie all of this into what is the state policy towards agriculture. How do we see agriculture? How does the government policy interpret agriculture? If the interpretation of agriculture is still the traditional way of getting produce done, of getting land cleaned and cultivated and so on, it is a major hurdle. But we have to find ways to provide incentives to get persons into the land, youths and adults. Now, over the years, there's a little secret that I think we have not been telling loud enough. There has been quite a number of young people getting involved in agriculture. Lots of young people are getting involved in agriculture. Lots of professionals are investing in agriculture. I know business CEOs in this country who are now buying lands, and on weekends and evenings, they are there on the land. They are farming, right? What that tells you as well, profitability. Wherever an industry is profitable, you'll find labor, you'll find skills going into that industry, because the profitability provides an incentive. It incentivizes people to want to get into it. So we need to have things there, and we have to get engaged in. So we need government policies that provide some level of predictability in the sector going forward. A key aspect to that has to be value added and agro-processing, right? The revolution provided us with a good platform of how we can begin the transformation in the agricultural sector by getting into value-added products, so that young people were not only going to get involved in the manual field production and so on, but they also have a role to play in developing skill set and technologies and knowledge for the agro-processing, for the factories, engineers for the factories, food technicians, people of all different types and skill sets. We need to get into that level. Unless we can speak of agriculture in those terms and provide incentives for people to get involved in agriculture, and getting involved not only for the sake of generating an income and an economic livelihood, but provide an opportunity for people to use their skill sets and their knowledge base, right? We are going to remain where we are. No amount of smart talking will move it. No amount of non-essential policies around it is going to move it. What we need are really policies and programs where people can see direct benefits coming out from agriculture, where we can assist and advise young people in terms of, for example, extension services, guidance on what to plant, when to plant, how to plant it, and have that tie back to markets. Now, I know that there are a couple of projects around currently that the AgriCom project, one of the aims is to create that kind of linkage between the farmer and the marketplace, right, and drive that. We have to know much more about it. We have to have, this thing has become a national drive. One of the reasons that the revolution succeeded in a short space of time was this element of it, which is the mobilization of the people, the mass mobilization of the people behind ideas, programs, and initiatives. When the revolution came up with themes of idle lands plus idle hands equal, increased production and so on and so forth, it was not just a slogan that stayed within that segment of the population called farmers or so, but the entire country was mobilized and made aware and educated and informed of what that means, what it will mean for the person that is not involved in agriculture, but is citizen of this country, how it will benefit the nation overall. So we need to get involved in mass mobilization of persons in various aspects of the agricultural sector, not just those who do the actual farming, right? But the entire society must be made to understand where these things are. So we have to stop paying lip service, and we have to do practical things. Another aspect, please allow me to just add this other aspect of the use of land. Now, in recent years, we have seen the rich agricultural lands being transformed and going into concrete development. Yeah. So what that is doing, it is really reducing the amount of available agricultural lands for agricultural production that can feed ourselves. It is going into concrete, therefore reducing the quantity of lands that would allow us to feed ourselves and at the same time find export income. That has to change, right? Because by pursuing such a policy, we are not only reducing the amount of lands that are available for agricultural production and so on, we are also making lands expensive and moving it away from the ownership of young people and the ownership of future generations. That we must change.
Now, you spoke quite a bit about young people in agriculture and young people that are actually getting involved in agriculture. And I ran into such a person just Monday gone, and he is going to be on the Talking Points program next Saturday right here. Okay. And he is very much involved in this smart agriculture. I mean, he's doing a wide variety of things. Mm-hmm. And so he's planting, he's doing agriculture, he's doing livestock, right? He's doing pigs, and he's able, therefore, to use the waste from the pig as for energy, biogas. Yeah. He also produces stuff, the dasheen and the whatever, and he's making local flour. Yeah. He bakes, he adds that to some of the imported flour and makes a unique product with his bread and whatever, and so that doesn't stay with him. He uses all of the things, breadfruits, bananas, you name it. He makes chips that doesn't remain with him. And then the other part of the waste from the biogas, it goes back into the land in the form of fertilizer. You know, so he has that process that's going on, you know. And he is saying that when he gets that to where he needs it to be, because he's in the midst of doing certain extensions, he can employ directly and indirectly about 300 people. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and this, Pablo, you're so correct, huh?
Yeah.
I sometimes at pains when I hear persons being very hard on young people and the youth for not involving in agriculture. There is growing interest in agriculture. There is growing participation by the younger generation, given the right conditions. They would get involved. I don't know the same person that you speak of, but again, I think we were probably at the same function when this young man spoke of using solar.
Right, yeah, oh yes, that young man, yeah.
Fantastic work taking place. And we need to encourage young people to get involved, and not always seems to be standing with a hammer over the head, and complaining that young people are not getting involved in agriculture. There is that. In fact, I think recently I was reading something where I think the GCNA is having a program to encourage young people into nutmeg production. So I think I read that somewhere. I hope I didn't dream it. But
no, you didn't dream it. I saw this flyer going around too.
Yes, it is. So there are moves in that direction, and more as we think. But it comes back to this. It is about government policies influencing people in the right direction. We cannot take a laissez-faire approach and says, well, people will determine what career they want and what they get involved in and so on. No, the world doesn't run that way. The developed countries do not reach where they are by that laissez-faire kind of attitude. Nationally, the government took on the responsibilities and provided guidance with information, with data, with research, doing the research and showing people, look, if you get into this sector, these are the benefits. That's how you do it. That's what could emerge. And so we need to drive it in that direction. We need national policies that are motivating, that is inspirational, that will bring benefit to this society and this country overall. And unless we can remove some of these deficiencies in the system and allow everyone to benefit, and that we do not continue to pursue policies of injustices, whether it's social, whether it's political, whether it's economic, and so on, but to provide an environment in this country that is conducive for the participation of all our people and for the benefits of all of our people, will continue to waddle and wobble. We will not move forward from where we are. Instead, we are going to go backwards. And I want to encourage young people to get involved in organizations, right? That will help you, whether with your debating skills, your organizational skills, your sporting skills. Get involved. This is your country. This is our country. It is for us. At the end of the day, we are the ones that are going to be the beneficiaries, right? Our parents fought for it. They secured it for us. We must continue to ensure that this piece of land called Grenada, this country of ours, Grenada, Carriacou, and Pittilmatnik, and all the other islets around it, that we continue to be part of the driving force and the ownership of this land. And we must
before we close for the afternoon, there's one other thing that I want to raise with you, and it's in keeping with the whole agricultural element. Back in 2014, CARICOM established a commission to look into a particular product, an agricultural product. The report was presented to CARICOM somewhere between June, August 2018. It was never presented to us here in Grenada, although it was done in the other islands. We saw sometime late last year, one of the major opposition political party, they came up with a policy on that product. Since then, there's been a lot of conversation about it. Government began to talk about it because although initially up until last year, our Prime Minister was saying not under his watch, when he made certain comments, there was some pullback that is not what he meant and so on. We saw that recently at a roundtable session, the present Minister of Agriculture indicated that they've already drafted legislation to take to Parliament on that issue. I'm speaking about the product or the plant that we call cannabis or marijuana. And you did a presentation at that session where you said at the beginning that your presentation was about, quote, economic and institutional considerations for the cultivation and marketing of high value marijuana or cannabis byproducts. Can you just in the next maybe in the next 3 to 4 minutes, tell us what that was all about and what was the takeaway from that round the table session?
Yes, very interesting session. So let me start by saying this, that from a developmental perspective, an economic development perspective, Pablo, we have to look at what we have in this country as our natural resource, which is land, water, and people, and how we can combine those for economic development. I may use cannabis sometimes for international audience, but I prefer to say the ganja. That's how we know it. That's culturally our phrase. That's our context. That's our word, right? So that forum to which you referred came about because the IAGDO, Sandra Faust and so on, the Grenada Conference of Churches actually came together to host this high-level roundtable on the current and future state of the industry. In fact, I've done some writing on this as well for an organization. And it was an interesting one. Yes, the Minister of Agriculture indicated the government's desire to do what they have indicated. And they have budgeted a paltry, what I call a paltry, $10,000 for consultation, national consultation on this issue. Let me hasten to say this on the institutional matter. This issue, in my opinion, my humble opinion, requires a national discussion. of the greatest magnitude, because we have different threads running around as to whether it should be accepted or not accepted, what degree of legalization should be, allowed, and so on and so forth. And we must bring together all these different shades of opinions into a national coherent policy that does not divide the country, but takes into account all the concerns of all of our peoples and blend it together in a harmonious way, right? That's one thing I want to say. On the issue of the economic aspects, I'm afraid that we are losing out on this. Our failure to move the industry and move with the industry rather quickly is going to cost us pain. We're not going to get the economic, the financial returns when we do get involved. So the extent to which we're going to get involved economically will depend on how we get involved. It would not be sufficient for us to look at the mere production of this herb, right? We have to look at the value added from it. If we are to focus purely on the production of it and to legalize the production of it, we will end up in the same way as nutmeg or cocoa, suffering from the boom and bust of the industry. Already, we are seeing countries in the north dominating that economic space. Countries that has heaped upon us forced legal measures that criminalize and that put legal blots on many of our young people, right? They are the main beneficiaries today of the legalization process. While we in our parts continue to drag our feet and not even get into the national debate and national discussion about it. When we enter this, the commodity called ganja, the price will drop significantly from what it is. In fact, in the last 5 years, I'm tracking it, the prices are actually declining. Where the money is being made in the same way as cocoa and nutmeg is in the value-added products, the manufacturing of byproducts from ganja. So I hope that the government is thinking through this issue and ask ourselves, how can we leverage economic benefits from this process? And it has to be beyond cultivation. The other economic thing that concerns me, which is linked to the institutional aspects, we have to ensure that the small man, the small farmer, especially those who were prosecuted in years gone by, are beneficiaries of whatever model that we are going to come up with. They have to be beneficiaries, right? It is like a kind of a compensation, in my view, for the years of prosecution of dealing in a crop that has now emerged and accepted legally, And the thing about it, ganja was not always illegal. It was made illegal, right, at some point. So we have to ensure from an economic point of view. So how do we do that? One of the things I'm proposing that we look at as an institutional model for beneficiaries is a cooperative type structure in the vein of cooperatives, in the vein of at the basic level of what GCNA Cocoa is now, but a hybrid organization that allows us to get into this thing in an organized, structured, institutional, and legal way, right? So we have persons producing, we may determine on license and how this is done and so forth. There are central buying points, there are central processing points, and we have the manufacturing facilities, which I will strongly promote that we have on island. We may need to develop partnerships with external experts in the field as well as financing. But I believe that we have sufficient money internally in the banks and our credit unions and so on that's lying around that can be invested in this space. So the institutional arrangement calls for a hybrid cooperative system that allows persons to plant in comfort, knowing that there is a buyer of the product, whatever quantities they produce, it will be purchased, and that product will then be processed in high value items for local consumption and the export market. We have a combination of things that we can do. But we need to go back to our brothers and sisters who have been using this for various health benefits and find out the combinations that are used, how they use it, right? And what benefits there. But it is something that we require as a nation to get engaged in. Our government needs to provide leadership. The National Democratic Congress last year put out a bold statement on it, but since then I have heard nothing or very little from them on it. In fact, they did not even participate in the high-level roundtable that was held. They were not part of that kind of discussion, right? But they made a bold statement on it and then literally, in my view, ducked, right, after that. But it is an important one, and it is one that probably would allow us to complement the existing agricultural products that we have, and so on. And that, by the way, leads me to, allow me a minute to make this connection. And that connection which I want to make has to do with the issue of ownership of land in this country. We are witnessing the purchase or of lands being either acquired, purchased, or whatever by persons other than ourselves. I am not against anyone from the outside coming to Grenada and investing in land or whatever. It is up to government policies. But I want to make sure, and we should make sure as a people, that we have lands for that kind of purpose. If we are going to get involved in the production of high quality ganja for health purposes, for medicinal purposes, right? And not just to allow people to smoke willy-nilly and develop all the complications that come from that willy-nilly dealing of this thing. We must ensure that government policies seek to secure land for that purpose. We must have our researchers doing the soil testing and creating the marriage between the soil type and the right species of ganja to be produced at the maximum levels so that we get the maximum production and productivity from it. And to secure those lands, for our people to be used for that purpose. Because one of the things we are likely to see happening is that as the United States, as most states in the US, open their doors and legalize ganja, and I'm sure within the very near future, it will become federal law so that there is no longer an offense to that. And as the Caribbean, as usual, follow suit behind the US and open up, we are going to see an influx of persons from outside coming to acquire land in Grenada for that purpose. Remember, and it has already started. Remember, we did not always own these lands that we now own. They were owned by foreigners. They were owned during slavery by slave masters and slave owners. We run the risk of a return of that under various guises. We run the risk. And for this commodity, which is expected to be a global high-value commodity, it is incumbent upon us as a people to seek the protection of the lands and the protection of our citizens for the production and manufacturing of high-quality byproducts, value-added products from ganja.
All right. So it's at this juncture that we have to pull the plug on this afternoon's conversation because we have a big thing coming up at the bottom of the hour, you see, and we had to get ready for that. So, Dr. Fletcher, it's a pleasure having had you here, and I believe that we did get into quite a bit. There's quite, a bit more that we should have been able to speak to, but I didn't send you the link when I suppose.
That's fine. That's not a problem.
What is the big deal coming on at the end of the have for you? So anyway, so let's pull. So at this point in time, we come to the end. I say thank you very much, and thank you to those who joined us. As we say, that's it for the Comfort Zone this afternoon. Until the next time. Bye-bye. Brother John, it's over to you.
All right.
Revolutionary greetings and thanks for having me again.
All right, man. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we got to rush out to the next show. They're waiting on the other side for the next link to come on. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Brother Stephen, comrade. Revolutionary greetings to you. And
thank you, comrade. Good to see you.
Yes, and I hope that we could share the link for you for the next show.
Please. Right. What is the next program?
Yeah, Lynn calling me right now. Comrade Lynn calling me right now. That is
Great,
the
good.
42nd anniversary of the revolution going on right now. All right.
Oh, yes, great. Yes.
It's happening right now. Okay? All right. I'm going to start right now. So, bye. Have a blessed evening. One love.
Thank you, man.
All right.
Great.
Yeah, man.
Bye.
Can you share that link so I can link with it one time?
Most definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. Come on in. Yes. I'm hitting the start button right now. Yeah, we're starting now. Yeah, we're starting now. I just hit the can come in now. Okay. Yeah, you can come in now. Come in now. Yeah. Yeah. Pardon me?